Sunday, May 5th, 4:59 p.m. Check this out. Yet now, apart from law, a righteousness of God. Hang on a second. Let me check my mic settings to make sure I'm at least hearable. Romans 3, 21, 22, 23, 24. Okay. Now, in the recent past, we've been looking at Romans 3, 21, and so forth, right? Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you. And I have, in looking at Romans 3, 21, 22, etc., I have been making a big deal over in 22, Jesus Christ's faith. And that's really cool because there's a tendency in the Christian universe to say faith in Christ, but it's the genitive case, which means it's kind of like in a possessive form. It's Jesus Christ's faith, not faith in Jesus Christ. It's Jesus Christ's faith. It's a big deal. What is the faith of Christ? And how does it differ from your own personal faith? Maybe you have faith, maybe you don't, but this verse 22 is talking about Jesus Christ's faith. How do we fit that into our pea brains and understand the revelation of God? What's different between Jesus Christ's faith and our faith? Wouldn't you agree that your faith is sketchy? I mean, there's been a recent hubbub over Brother Andy taking a hike out of our Christian circles and running over to that Zeitgeist film and, seeing a lot of history of religion, and maybe this isn't all it's cracked up to be, that we in the Christian community have an exclusive right on these ideas, that maybe he can find some truth in Hinduism or whatever, and so the fundamentalist Christians are all upset with Andy for not being so fundamentalist Christian anymore. And so they've been saying, oh my God, what do we do? Ace, you're responsible for him. Go get him. Bring him back into the fold. I don't own Andy. And my retort to that is that God is the author and finisher of our faith. You don't know the end of where God is taking Andy. God is the one who began this journey of faith in Andy, and God will complete it because all is of God. So what is the difference between Jesus Christ's faith and Andy's faith? Well, Andy's faith, we all would admit, is not perfect. It's exploratory, it's searching, it's breathless, it's cloudy. The Christian's faith is not perfect. So what would you rather trust your own faith, or would you rather trust Jesus Christ's faith? What did Jesus Christ have faith in? Well, he had faith in God. But Jesus was God or is God, whatever. I don't know, you can find all kinds of excuses to violently embrace your faith and defend your faith. But what is Jesus Christ's faith? And I would say, upon reflection, that my faith can be sketchy, but Jesus Christ's faith is probably perfect, because he was at least somewhat closer to God than I am. So I would rather trust Jesus Christ's faith than my faith. I would rather trust Jesus Christ's faith than Andy's faith, I would rather trust Jesus Christ's faith than Praise I Am's faith or Bill's faith or Jamie Russell's faith or who else is left? Bruce. I'd rather trust Jesus Christ's faith than Bruce's faith. And how about Preterist and Jill and Beckel? And yeah, I would rather trust Jesus Christ's faith in these great matters to accomplish something, if not all things, than any of the Christians' faith I've ever met. Go over to the Christian channels, and they are arguing over who has the perfect faith. But they never argue over whether or not Jesus Christ had the perfect faith. But here in verse 22, it's right there on the screen, there's something called Jesus Christ's faith. Okay, so in recent times, we've been looking at Romans 3, 21, 22, 23, 24, been trying to figure out what the heck is going on in these beautiful words. And I have made a big deal over Jesus Christ's faith. And then I got around to making a big deal over Jesus Christ's faith for all. Jesus Christ's faith for all. Wow. Who would have ever thought that he could have faith for all? Now that's a big deal worth exploring. He didn't just have faith for himself. What do you know? He had faith for all. Can we trust these words? Can we trust that Jesus Christ had faith for all? Well, I think we can. Because from my own personal experience, I have moved away from trusting my faith, trusting my trust, into considering Jesus Christ's faith. And I think I can see and grasp and rejoice in the idea that Jesus Christ had faith not only for himself, but he had faith for all. Okay, so we got that far. Oh, also, in the recent past, we were examining Romans 3, 21, 22, 23, 24. We were examining that. Just how do we understand this? Well, it's a righteousness of God that is manifested through Jesus Christ's faith. Okay? Okay, so the righteousness of God, check this out. It's a new thought to the fresh Christian mind. Because again, we've thought, given this some thought that most people think righteousness is their own right behavior, their own good deeds, and their own moral ethics, blah, blah, blah. But what is the righteousness of God revealed through Jesus Christ and revealed through Jesus Christ's faith and revealed through Jesus Christ's faith for all? Very good question. That displays God's righteousness, if we can even understand what righteousness is, period. Okay, so we've spent some time exploring the righteousness of God. We've spent some time exploring the righteousness of God through Jesus Christ's faith, and for Jesus Christ's faith for all. Different breakdowns of these two little verses thus far. Okay, now, what we did not explore... Okay, wait. It's a given. It's a given that on all who are believing, that's kind of obvious as to what that means. Those who are believing now are appreciating these matters. Oh, well, let's go down this road and say, those who are believing, what are they believing? It's a good question. What exactly are they believing? Are they believing that Jesus Christ's faith for all reveals the righteousness of God? Now, I would say courageously, recklessly, boldly, that most people who name the name of Christian, they do not believe anything about Romans 3, 21 and 22. They don't believe that Jesus Christ had faith, because they use all those popular Bible translations that say faith in Jesus Christ. Well, the prepositional phrase would not be in, it probably should be of. It's at least possessive. It's called the genitive case. Jesus Christ's faith, or the faith of Jesus Christ for all. Are they believing that Jesus Christ had faith? No, they won't even allow themselves a moment to believe that Jesus Christ had faith, because they are confused about who Jesus Christ is, because they're so wrapped up in the Trinity doctrine. And they say, well, Jesus is God, so how can Jesus have faith? And, it's a cloudy issue in their minds, right? So on all who are believing, it's in green right there on the screen. On all who are believing, the Christians are not believing this message so far. But if we give the Christians a break and say, yeah, they really are Christians and they are chosen of God and they're part of the elect and all this other business, so we would give them this hat tip that they're believing something about the matter, that this is an important matter, even though they won't agree with Romans 3:21 and 22. Yeah, they're believers, so let's rejoice. But here's something I think we missed, okay, in the discussions. And I didn't even know that we missed it until a couple of the brothers mentioned that they got really excited for the last few words in verse 22, for there is no distinction. I didn't spend a lot of time on for there is no distinction. I spent more time on the righteousness of God being manifested through Jesus Christ's faith, and Jesus Christ's faith for all. And we'll just use on all who are believing as a throwaway line, because would you want to get in a fight with a Christian and tell them they're not believing? I would, because they're not believing that Jesus Christ had faith and that he had faith for all. But check this out. There's a big deal here. I haven't highlighted it except for bolding and underlining, for there is no distinction. Now we're talking, because it has come to my attention most recently over on the regular old Christian YouTube channels. They say there is a distinction between the believing and the non-believing. In fact, Uncle Brucey Woosey, has come over here and say, and over on Linda's channel, when I was hanging out, at a distance with Bruce and Linda, on Linda's channel, Bruce and Linda said, you got to believe. You got to believe, Ace. Believe is all over the Bible. You must believe, inferring that if you don't believe, there's hell to pay. You're going to go to hell if you don't believe, right? But this would seem to address all of those fellow knuckleheads, for there is no distinction. Where do we jam this thought into our heads regarding these words in 21 and 22? It has to be there's no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving. Cool. Why would there be no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving? Well, in verse 23, there's this little connective called for. Don't you love connectives? Because when you have a larger thought, you don't just put a period there. You don't just stop the thought. It's even larger than you thought. And you bring in a connective. For all have sinned. There's no difference between the believing and the non-believing, because all have sinned. And this is the basis for which we can understand this righteousness of God. We're not talking about the righteousness of any individual good person, or any individual Christian, or any individual saint or disciple of Christ or apostle. We're talking about the righteousness of God. It's revealed. Verse 21, it's manifest through Jesus Christ's faith. It is not manifest through Paul's faith or Peter or James or John or Matthew or Judas. The righteousness of God is manifest through Jesus Christ's faith. And it's for all. Jesus Christ had faith for all, and it's such a huge dynamic that Paul can take it to the extreme and say, it's on all who are believing, but there's no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving. For all have sinned. Are you with me? Let me put this word all in red so that I can point out something to you that, okay, in verse 22, the word all shows up 2 times, okay? We've got faith for all who are believing, no distinction, all sinned. And finally, we're into a huge smackdown. Paul's use of the word all goes from hugely expansive down to a little narrow limit, and then back to hugely expansive, like an accordion maybe. We're trying to get a big concept going here. Jesus Christ's faith for all who are believing and all who are not believing. But the on business, it's on at the moment. It's on. How you like that phrase? It's on. Remember the movie with Robert Redford called The Sting? Well, when these, it was a movie about some con artists who developed a huge con on the biggest gangster in town. And when these guys, these con artists, pulled their team together, they would go around to where their team was and they would stroke their nose with one swipe. And that meant the con is on. On is a kind of special preposition. And here we see that it's on. All who are believing, the con is on. The action is on. The movement has begun. The movement of blessing and appreciation of the blessing is on all who are believing, but that is not going to stop with the believing, because Jesus Christ's faith for all is that which reveals the righteousness of God. It's a righteousness of God that is manifested through Jesus Christ's faith for all, and on all who are believing. But here's the deal I wanted to bring up today on this little episode, that there's no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving, and that would make perfect sense, because the believing did not generate their own believing, and the believing do not manifest God's righteousness. They just believe God's righteousness being manifested through Jesus Christ's faith. There's no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving in this regard, because God's righteousness is manifested through Jesus Christ's faith for all. So a couple of brothers pointed out to me that they got really excited for this business of "for there is no distinction." And it went, kind of went over my head. I didn't see why we should make a big deal of it. But I now see, yes, we should make a big deal of it, because Bill and Bruce and Praise and Linda and Jamie, Russell, and all the usual suspects say there is a distinction between the believing and the unbelieving, because the believers go to hell and the unbelievers the believing, sorry, got that wrong. The believing go to heaven and the unbelievers go to hell, and too bad. But This is not the only place where the believing are marginalized. This is chapter 3, right? Romans 3. Well, if we back up to chapter 3 as well, in verse 3, chapter 3, verse 3, for what if some disbelieve? What? Yeah. Ask Bill, Bruce, Linda, Jamie, praise I am, all the Foursquare pastors and the Calvary Chapel pastors and the Baptists and the Catholics. Ask them about verse 3. What if some disbelieve? Will not their unbelief nullify the faithfulness of God? Well, Paul says in verse 4, I'll say it isn't so. In other words, the disbelief in humanity, in Christians, shall we say, the Christian unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, because the faithfulness of God, and it wouldn't be hard to say not only the faithfulness of God, but we're talking about the righteousness of God is revealed through the faith of Christ. So we got 3:21-22. We're talking about the righteousness of God. It wouldn't be hard to say the faithfulness of God is also manifest through Jesus Christ's faith for all. The righteousness of God is manifest through Jesus Christ's faith by his faith which took him to the cross. And the faithfulness of God is manifest through Jesus Christ's faith for all. Either way, there is some language here that the Christians refuse to accept and refuse to incorporate in their jingoism. And the language is, there is no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving. We can allow our hearts, I suppose, to be melted so that we can have compassion on those yahoos who are not believing at the moment, because there's no distinction between them and us. It is God who manifests his righteousness and faithfulness through Jesus Christ's faith for all. God does not have in view here a big deal between the believing and the unbelieving. A big deal to the point of saying there's no distinction. I mean, just by mentioning that there is such a thing as believing and unbelieving, well, you're creating, a minor point. Yes, there's a little bit of, we can at least say that there are believers and we can say that there are unbelievers, but in the grand scheme of things, there is no distinction. And I've looked at this verse just an hour ago over in the King James Bible, and the King James has it worded in such a way, for there is no difference. It kind of tones down any ability to raise an eyebrow. What we're looking at is the concordant literal New Testament. For there is no difference is King James. For there is no distinction is the concordant literal New Testament. And I'm thinking the concordant literal New Testament is more of a wild slap in the face. It will help you raise an eyebrow. And this is eyebrow raising material. Verse 3, for what if some don't believe? Shall their unbelief nullify the faithfulness of God? And then Paul basically says in verse 4, bite me. You're missing the point. The greater point is that the faithfulness of God and the righteousness of God is revealed through Jesus Christ's faith for all. There's no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving in the absolute sense. In a temporal sense, maybe we can see that some are appreciating these matters. I wouldn't say that the Christians are appreciating these matters. They make a big deal and say that there is a big distinction between the believing and the unbelieving. And the unbelieving are going to hell, don't you know? And again, verse 23 starts with the word for, so it's definitely a tie-in. It's still got the cadence going of what we're talking about. Why is it that Jesus Christ's faith for all manifests God's righteousness? Well, it's because all have sinned. For all have sinned. The sinning universe, shall we say, is universal, and Jesus Christ's faith for all is universal. We can bitch all we want about the sinning universe, and just point out each other's sins, and you sin more than I do, and make a big deal out of it because I'm a believer and I sin less than you. For all sinned, says verse 23. And I put the next couple of alls in brackets because they're not there in the Greek text, but they're implied because the word all in red, highlighted in red, shows up 3 times in the Greek text, and therefore there's a cadence going. And so we shouldn't minimize the cadence just because it's missing in the text, because it's called an ellipsis. When you think that your audience is catching on to the cadence of your discussion, you can shorten the sentence. For all sinned, wanting of the glory of God. It's for all sinned and are wanting of the glory, and all are wanting of the glory of God. For all sinned and all are wanting of the glory of God. If you're sinning, you're lacking and you're needing the glory of God. And you will get the glory of God through Jesus Christ's faith for all. And in 24, the ellipsis of the all is missing in the Greek text, only because it's the cadence and it's a style of communicating, and we all use the ellipsis in communicating with each other. And Paul uses the ellipsis. And what is the ellipsis? It's the cadence of the word all. Jesus Christ's faith for all and on all. For all sinned 3 times, and all are wanting of the glory of God, and all are being justified gratuitously in his grace. So again, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time with you and show you that there is no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving. And you maybe should help me spread the word. Go tell Praise I Am and Bill and Bruce and Linda and all them Calvary Chapel pastors and all them hellfire enthusiasts that there's no distinction, that we're all lumped in this together, that God's grand vision is to bless all mankind. And it's not just to give us an opportunity to be saved. No, it's to save us and present us inside, wrapped up and filled up with the glory of God and the blessing of being justified gratuitously. What does that mean? Oh gosh, it would be another topic of conversation. But I will say, verse 24, that being justified gratuitously in his grace goes far beyond anything that the born again people have to talk about, because they've got a storyline, a plot line, that being born again is very special and they are born again and you are not. But verse 24 is all about all being justified gratuitously in his grace. Not being justified if you do the right thing, because in the Christian lingo, they think that Christ's death and resurrection on the cross merely provides an opportunity or a possibility for you to get your act together and prove to God that you are worth saving. But this is not the language of Paul in Romans 3, 21, 22, 23, 24. The language of Paul is far beyond that. It's proof that Paul was not a Baptist. He was not a charismatic. He was not a fellow who limited the vision and purpose and doings of God. Yet now, apart from law, a righteousness of God is manifest. Not everybody can see it yet, but it is manifest, and it's manifest through Jesus Christ's faith. And it's manifest through Jesus Christ's faith for all. And lucky for us, it's on all who are believing, but it's for all. But there's no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving, because all sinned and all are wanting of the glory of God, and all are being justified gratuitously. And notice the verb form in verse 24. All are being justified gratuitously. Doesn't sound like it's in the past tense. Might be a little bit in the future tense, but it's actually timeless. It is the work of God we are considering. It's not that God is done with his work. It's happening. People are being justified today gratuitously in his grace, and they will be being justified gratuitously in the future. And in fact, we will reach the point in time at the conclusion of the eons when every knee bows and every tongue gladly acclaims that Jesus Christ is Lord, and they will be justified in doing that. And that's not a too late thing. You know, we warned you, now you're going to hell after you bow the knee and confess with your tongue. No, they're being justified gratuitously in his grace. The very notion of an eternal hell fire doesn't sound anything like being justified gratuitously in his grace. These are big words, deep and beautiful with meaning. Being justified gratuitously in his grace through the deliverance which is in Christ Jesus, whom God purposed. Another lovely big word that you won't hear the Christians talking about. They don't talk about the purpose of God, whom God purposed for a propitiatory shelter through God's faith in his son's blood. So not only did Christ have faith in God, but God had faith in his son. And what we see in the Bible is a grand love story between God and his son, and their accomplishment together in creation, redemption, conciliation, justification, ransom. God is the Savior of all, and he saves all through his son, whom God purposed for a propitiatory shelter through God's faith in his son's blood for a display of his righteousness. Oh, we're back to the display. Verse 21 said a manifestation that his righteousness is manifested through Christ's faith. And now he uses the word display. His son's blood is the display of his righteousness. We got nothing to contribute to the whole thing. At best, we are recipients of grace, and we can't even brag on that. Paul tells us over and over again that there's not much to brag about in this grand evangel of grace. We don't contribute not one straw to the matter. We are just recipients of grace. If God gives us the faith to believe, we will believe. And if God does not give us the faith to believe, we don't believe just yet. But we are not saved through our faith. We are saved, and all this wonderful righteousness of God is revealed through Jesus Christ's faith for all. There's no distinction between the believers and the unbelievers, because our belief and our faith has nothing to do with it. The real crux of the matter is very and all dependent on Jesus Christ's faith. If you believe these matters, well, bless your little heart. If you don't believe these matters, well, bless your little heart. But if Jesus Christ has faith in God, well, now we're talking about a big story, a big plot line that you just will not hear in the Christian jingoism of I'm saved and you're not. You suck. No, you suck. No, you suck. Tell me about Jesus Christ's faith for all. I want to hear about that. And by the way, while you're telling me about Jesus Christ's faith for all, tell me that there's no distinction between the believing and the unbelieving. I want to hear about that one too. That's really cool. Because God doesn't look at our faith as having any efficacy, because he gives us the faith. It's not something we gin up on our own. He gives us the faith to believe these matters. And when we believe these matters, there's a great deal of peace that comes along with it, because it's better to trust Jesus Christ's faith than to trust our own faith. Whom God purposed for propitiatory shelter through God's faith in his Son's blood, for a display of his righteousness, because of the passing over of the penalties of sins which occurred before in the forbearance of God, toward the display of his righteousness in the current era, for him to be just and a justifier of the one who is of the faith of Jesus. There we go with two ofs, the genitive case again. Where then is boasting? Well, the Christians can no longer boast, because this is not of your faith. If it's of the faith of Jesus, there's nothing that you can boast about. You sound ridiculous when you boast of your Christian faith. Where is boasting? It is debarred. Verse 27. Through what law? Isn't it funny that Paul throws in the law in the same verse as the word boasting? Isn't that funny? Because all those boasting boys and girls, they seem to favor a list of do's and don'ts and shoulds and should nots. That gives a lot of room for boasting and pride and arrogance. Where then is boasting? We can't boast, because this whole action of God of displaying his righteousness and redemption and salvation and the finishing up of creation all happens through the faith of Jesus Christ for all. Verse 28, is it of works, law and works? No, but through faith law. What is faith law? Could this, verse 28, could faith law be a reference to verse 22, Jesus Christ's faith for all? So what is faith law? It is the appreciation of the accomplishment of Jesus Christ when he went to the cross and had faith that God would raise him from the dead. Did God raise him from the dead? You bet. This big idea that Jesus Christ had faith in God, which enabled him to go to the cross, and then God raising him from the dead, maybe we can call that faith's law, like the law of gravity. It's all that it is accomplished through Christ's faith. Verse 28. Where then is boasting? No boasting. Knock it off. But we can talk about faith law and what it accomplishes, for we are reckoning a man to be justified by the faith of Christ apart from works of law. Or is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not of the nations also? Yes, of the nations also, if so be that God is one. Okay, that's all I got. Thanks for joining me. Leave your comments, give me a thumbs up, and grace to you.